The $34 trillion problem is one problem. To me, the larger problem is the net present value of entitlements. Medicare, Medicaid, well, looking at the camera, old folks like me. The net present value of the off-balance sheet liabilities of the U.S. government, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, federal government pensions, stuff like that, exceeds $100 trillion. This isn't Joe Littman's estimate or Rick Rule's estimate. This is the estimate of the Congressional Budget Office, who, by the way, have traditionally underestimated that liability. That bothers me. When I look at the world outside of the collective, which is to say outside of government, I'm extremely positive. In the United States, we have a society that's so creative that a group of teenagers can take over a garage in Sunnyvale and out pops Google. Thus far, our individual tenacity and creativity has funded our collective stupidity. What has changed between now and the 1970s is that in 1970, in the decade of the 70s, the on-balance sheet liabilities of the US government was about 25% of GDP. Now it's 110%. I share much of Littman's positivity in the long term. I'm concerned about the near term. That's the reason I have him here. Right. Too often in my conference, the theme is going to be, the world's going to end on Thursday, here's how you can profit.
Right.
I look at the economy that we have in terms of the strength, and Daniela, it works for you and I. It works for people who have skill sets that generate real utility in the economy. There are too many people in this economy who don't have the skill sets. They aspire to the same lifestyle that you have and the same lifestyle that I have, but they don't have the ability to generate enough utility for others that they can make the income that we do. And it's not working for them. I look in the little village that I live in Washington. There's a labor shortage there. And somebody who starts at Safeway makes $20 an hour, which sounds like a lot of money in the dollars that you and I were brought up with. But $20 an hour in my little village isn't a living wage. So while the economy is working for you and I, it isn't working for a lot of Americans. And a lot of Americans resent that. If you look at the world the way I do, is the debtor going to be able to pay you back? The answer is no.
Did you know that the US government faces an off-balance sheet liability exceeding $100 trillion? This staggering figure, estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, highlights the net present value of entitlements like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and federal government pensions. Rick Rule, a renowned financial expert, draws parallels between our current financial landscape and the 1970s, when the purchasing power of the US dollar plummeted by over 80%. Today, our on-balance sheet liabilities have surged from 25% of GDP in the 1970s to 110%, indicating that while the nominal $100 trillion liability may remain, we'll likely pay it back with a significantly devalued currency. Rule warns that relying on cash could be disastrous, emphasizing that the period from 1982 to 2022 was an unusually benign epoch for American investors. But those days are over. He predicts a replay of the 1970s, where inflation eroded savings and paychecks, and people took years to grasp the full impact. Although the US dollar might still fare better than other major currencies, its purchasing power is set to decline. If you're relying on cash, you might be setting yourself up for financial disaster.
I suspect that the actuarial response, I suspect what happens is two things. I think we have a replay of the 1970s in the sense that I think the purchasing power of the US dollar goes down, which is to say the nominal $100 trillion liability stays in place, but we pay it back with a currency where the purchasing power declines. People forget that in the decade of the 1970s, the purchasing power of the US dollar fell by more than 80%. So I think that's part of the answer, sadly. I think the other part of the answer is that they will absolutely means test Social Security, which is to say that people who've made a lot of money and paid into it won't get anything out. And I think they have to raise the age limit. What they do about healthcare costs is going to be a very interesting challenge. Healthcare has become very politicized in the United States, and I'm obviously, as you know, Daniela, not a political analyst, and I don't understand how you resolve, as an example, the age debate. My generation voted ourselves all kinds of cool benefits. We forgot to pay for them, so we're leaving your generation with a bill. The truth is the 1970s were ugly. We had civil strife in the United States. By civil strife, I mean riots in the streets. I decided to go to school in Canada because I lived in California. I didn't want to wear a gas mask to get to class, that kind of stuff. We devalued the dollar in a closet sense by 80%, but we got through it. And I'm not sure how we get through this. Part of me says over 15 years, we grow our way out. I'm hoping in a very positive sense that, like Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing when they're left with no other alternatives. So I think the dollar will be the world's reserve currency for the rest of my life. For the record, I'm a very healthy 71-year-old. Because look at the competitors. Doug Casey famously said the US dollar is the worst currency in the world with the sole exception of every other currency. I don't think that we're going to get through this easily, but I do believe that a society that is as clever as ours, with the distribution of intelligence as broadly spread as ours, will do well. I also believe that there is increasingly a globalization of opportunity and skill. And my hope, and I have to say it's a hope, is that a rise in living standards in places like Malawi and Brazil and Nigeria and Indonesia is as profound as the increase in living standards in China was. And I hope, too, that globalization of opportunity will make everyone, including Americans, richer. Now, that may be a naive hope. As I say, I have observed that over time, our individual creativity has financed our collective stupidity. If I'm wrong, the outcome is truly ugly. I think the euro has been a slow motion failure, and I think the failure of the euro will continue to escalate. Again, Doug Casey says the US dollar is an I owe you nothing, the euro is a who owes you nothing, and the BRICS is a nobody owes you anything. Think about the constituents to that. Non-convertible currencies, countries that don't trust us but trust each other less, a marriage of convenience, not a marriage of love. Imagine, as an example, a currency that's nobody's obligation, that everybody takes the credit for, nobody takes the blame for. Imagine that the constituents have no reserve liability to it. Now imagine that you're the Chinese and you run up the US dollar equivalent of $1 trillion trade surplus with Russia.
Right.
There's only so much vodka you can import. What do you do with the balance? What will happen is if they even settle bilaterally, which is to say they settle in rubles and yuan, ultimately they will convert one or the other of those into something they can spend, which is a US dollar. The US dollar, for all its fault, is the only liquid, transparent currency in the world. The US Treasury market, for all its fault, is extremely liquid and extremely transparent, and there is no other financial instrument in the world that comes close to it. I mean, I absolutely positively believe that the US dollar will lose substantial purchasing power in the next 10 years. I don't think it'll lose as much purchasing power as the yen does. I don't think it'll lose as much purchasing power as the British pound does. I don't think it'll lose as much purchasing power as the euro. But I think it will continue to lose purchasing power, which is to say, again quoting Doug Casey, the prettiest mare at the slaughterhouse. The period 1982 to 2022 was probably the most benign epoch in human history, particularly for American investors. The US dollar had hegemony. We had continuing rate cuts. It was a wonderful set of circumstances. Anything that went wrong in our country, we could print it away, people would buy it. So we exported our difficulties to other places. I think that ended in 2022. If I am right, it takes me back again to the decade of the 70s. In 1967, inflation was present. People noticed it. They had this thing called whip inflation now, WIN, which they didn't do. But it took the period 1967 to 1972 for Americans to understand the compound perniciousness of inflation. They had been schooled in 20 good years since the end of World War II to expect that things got better and better and better. While they were expecting things to get better, the price of a gallon of gas went from 20 cents to $1. It took them 5 years to understand the ravages of inflation on their savings and on their paychecks. But when they came to understand it
Yeah.
in 1972, they understood it in earnest. My suspicion is that we are going to experience the same delayed reaction for the same reason. We are conditioned to look at the economy, to look at markets, by the period 1982 to 2022, which was pretty damn good.
Right.
The consequence of that is that the writing that we see on the wall doesn't scare us as much as it otherwise would. During the decade of the 70s, by 1980, everybody expected the world's worst possible outcomes, which is, of course, when things started turning good. And I think that's the situation. I think that we have been conditioned to expect things in the future that we've experienced in the immediate past. And that has inured us to the lessons of history.